Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to give it just a couple minutes before we start to allow some more folks to join us. Hope everyone is having a great day so far. Good afternoon. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. You're just joining, we're just going to get started in a couple minutes, just allowing a few more folks to join us. All right. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to Inner City Law Center's Community Conversation. We are so glad that you joined us today. I'm Karika Thompson, the Director of Development here at ICLC. We started having community conversations earlier this year as a way to bring together people and organizations that do work in the housing, justice, and homelessness space, and to really help shed light on the work being done and the issues that unhoused people are facing. Inner City Law Center has been around for 45 years, and from our inception, our focus has been on helping to end homelessness and advocating for systemic change related to affordable housing and treating those who are unhoused with dignity and respect. That is why we felt the conversation today was the timely one to have. We have an amazing group of panelists and moderators to discuss today's topic, the criminalization of homelessness. Before I introduce our moderator, Adam Murray, I want to give a few housekeeping reminders. This is a webinar, so no one other than the panelists and myself, camera or sound is on. This is also being recorded, so we'll share it out with everyone. The panelists will go through questions that we've come up with and also include questions that were submitted in advance. And we will allow time at the end for questions from our virtual audience, all of you watching. So please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Adam Murray, the Chief Executive Officer at Inner City Law Center. ICLC is a nonprofit poverty law firm serving the most vulnerable individuals and families in Los Angeles. Founded on the fundamental principle that every person should always be treated with dignity and respect, ICLC's 150 plus staff and over 500 volunteers provide free legal representation and advocacy to thousands of homeless and working poor clients, focused on combating slum housing, preventing homelessness, and aiding homeless veterans. Prior to joining ICLC, Adam was a litigator with the international law firm Howry LLP. Adam currently serves on the board of the Legal Aid Association of California. He previously served as president of the boards of the Housing Rights Center of Southern California and the Immigration Center for Women and Children, and has taught economics and political science at East LA College. Adam's also a former board member of the Fair Housing Council of the San Gabriel Valley, the ACLU of Southern California, and the Center for Progressive Leadership. So welcome, Adam, and take it away.
Thanks, Karika. Great to be here and great to be with you all discussing this very important topic. We have, as Karika mentioned, a really fabulous panel for you today. And I'm going to jump just in a second to introducing them and jumping right into the conversation. But I do just want to say one thing about this topic before we jump into it, which is that while it is obviously very important, and we wouldn't be holding this conversation if it wasn't important for us to discuss this, it's also really heartbreaking that we have to have this conversation. You know, the policies we're going to talk about today are just incredibly damaging, incredibly painful, incredibly dangerous to the people who are living on the streets or living in shelters or living in their cars who are struggling to get by. And so just the inhumanity that these policies represent is truly heartbreaking, especially when juxtaposed with the fact that as you will hear from many of our panelists today, we know that these policies are not effective at ending homelessness. So you put together the inhumanity of the approach and the pain that this is causing and the damage that this is causing to people who are struggling with the fact that it's really ineffective public policy. And it's just heartbreaking that we have to continue year after year to talk about these issues and to continue to fight on these issues. With that said, it is very important that we do so, of course. And we have an amazing group of folks gathered today to lead us through a conversation about these issues. And it's my privilege to be able to ask them a series of questions. And then, as Karika said, we will have time at the end for questions from you all. So please put your questions in the Q&A as we are going through. I want to start by introducing Tristia Bauman, who is currently the Directing Attorney of Housing at the Law Foundation of Silicon Valley. In her current role, Tristia and her team do a lot of work that's very similar to what Inner City Law Center does in Southern California, but they do it in Northern California, and a lot of focus on preventing housing loss and community displacement in Silicon Valley in particular. So Tristia went to law school because of a focus on dismantling systems that create poverty and inequality. And she's dedicated her life and her career to working on those issues and continues to do so in this space around criminalization of homelessness. Tristia, it's great to have you. Welcome to the panel.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
Next up, we have Donald H. Whitehead, who is currently the Executive Director of the National Coalition for the Homeless. This is an organization that is nationally renowned for focusing on lasting solutions, local solutions to addressing the root causes of homelessness, and is frequently a real outspoken voice on these questions of criminalization. And Donald, in particular, has a long and storied history of working in this arena, which I won't go through. All the panelists requested me to be brief with my bio, so I won't run through all of their accolades. But let me just say that Donald is really a leading national expert on homelessness, and in particular on this question of, are we doing well by folks who are on the streets? Are we treating them with dignity and respect in how we go about our policies? So Donald, it's great to have you as well.
Adam, thank you for allowing me to be here. Really appreciate the opportunity.
And our third panelist is currently the CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And in this role, Ann Oliva works closely with members of Congress and with the administration, as well as officials and advocates at the state and local level on the issues that we're going to talk about today, and more broadly on issues related to solutions to homelessness and how we are going to solve this problem. Ann is also recognized as one of the foremost experts on homelessness in the United States. And so we are very lucky to have her with us as well for this conversation. Welcome, Ann.
Thanks, Adam. Great to be here.
So let me just jump right in with a series of questions. And I know you all well enough to know you won't be shy. I want you to not be shy about jumping in and asking one another questions or responding to whatever it is that you hear from me or others in whatever way you want. But I have a series of questions to sort of at least frame our conversation a bit. And Anne, I want to start with you and ask you, when we talk about criminalization, when we use that phrase, what are we talking about? What do we mean by that? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question to start with. And I'll start this answer by first saying that there's a specific kind of environment that we've had in place for the last decade or so that has really sort of made criminalization a bigger and bigger issue year over year. And what I mean by that is that every year since 2016, we have seen an increase in unsheltered homelessness across the country. And between 2023 and 2024, that increase was 18%. The year prior to that was 12%. And what that means in practical terms is that homelessness is becoming more and more visible to housed people and to elected leaders. And as housed people and businesses and others interact with unsheltered people more often because there are more of them, the pressure on elected leaders to be seen as quote unquote, like doing something about the problem becomes more and more intense. And it drives them in a lot of cases to make decisions that I would categorize as political rather than strategic. A strategic decision would be to make investments in supportive services and housing that people need to end their individual homelessness or to end homelessness within a community. That would be a strategic decision because we know that housing and supportive services actually is the answer here. But what people do instead, or what some elected leaders are doing instead, is what we generally call criminalization. And what we mean by that is that is when somebody is fined, ticketed, or arrested for performing the activities that the rest of us do in private, in public spaces, like sleeping and eating, or simply just existing in public spaces because they have nowhere else to go. And sometimes we see criminalization show up as a very direct local ordinance, state law, like a camping ban. People are not allowed to camp in public parks or in other types of spaces. That is a very direct form of criminalization because people are fined, ticketed, or arrested for breaking that ordinance. But sometimes we also see criminalization either used in conjunction with something like that, or through more indirect means, like enforcement of an encroachment ordinance, which means that you can't block the sidewalks. And in some communities, that is the way that localities are enforcing a de facto camping ban or finding, ticketing, and arresting people for being homeless, is because they say that they're blocking the sidewalk with their belongings. So it can take sort of a couple of different paths, but at its core, it's about not making political decisions rather than strategic decisions, and fine, ticketing, and arresting people simply for existing as unsheltered in public spaces.
Thank you. I think that I think puts us in the right space of understanding what it is we're talking about. Let me ask Donald if you can expand a bit. And Anne started to touch on this a little bit, but why are these policies so popular? What is it? Why do we find over and over again that this is where folks seem to go?
So I think that's another very good question. I think there's a number of answers to that. I would add to what Anne shared is that not only did we see that 30% increase, but it followed a period of time when we saw very few people on the street in general, and very few people experiencing homelessness. It came right after COVID, where we not only saw federal resources that helped move people off of the street and actually prevent people from getting on the street. But then we saw this explosion, this 30% increase. And so politicians were reacting to the pressure from local residents. Residents were really outraged, especially those in the touristy industry or property owners or businesses, where people were forced to make their living situation, the sidewalk next to that institution or a park that was in the area. So residents were outraged by that. And I don't necessarily think their response was one that promoted the idea of arresting, fining, or jailing people, but they just didn't want to see people on the streets of their city. And so for politicians, having a quick fix, as Anne talked about, became a political incentive. And if you tied it to the idea of reducing crime, it actually helped politicians make the case that they were doing something about crime. Now, we all know that research tells us what they were doing was not the right thing, but it also gave the appearance of doing something to reduce the number of people we saw on our streets and on our sidewalks in the country. And I also think that we have to look towards our federal elected officials. Part of the reason why those long-term, more strategic solutions are not implemented is because the resources aren't available. we have never had enough resources to meet the needs of people experiencing homelessness at the level of need. So we have very myopic solutions that target populations that almost pit populations against each other, but having the resources that truly address the issue of homelessness in a comprehensive way we've never had. So the lack of resources coming from the federal government, we knew 40 years ago that you couldn't solve this issue on a local level alone. You needed help from the federal government, and the federal government, I think, has been lacking in that area for a very long time. And certainly that is another reason that the federal funding gaps are another reason that our local officials resort to criminalization. Again, I think people want to see less people on the street, and they don't, research says that they don't really think that criminalization is the right thing to do, but they don't know what else to do. And that is the solution that they've been given by their elected officials. Others, I would say, are just mean-spirited. They're people that think of homelessness as a moral failure versus a societal failure. And so they resort to these criminalization practices. So those are the reasons. It is expensive to provide the kind of resources that are needed to address homelessness. And sometimes it's just a matter of priorities. We see all kinds of playground areas for the affluent in our community, stadiums and art facilities that regularly go up. We see a lot of high-end housing. We just don't see the kind of support for people who are at the bottom of the economic ladder and tend not to be a force to reckon with when it comes to the electoral process. So those are the reasons, I think. I think that those are the ones that are on the surface. Certainly there are other reasons that are not top line issues.
Great. Can you talk a little bit more, Donald? You mentioned the research around whether or not this is effective, or saying it's really not effective. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What do we know from, because I know this has been extensively studied, what do we know about criminalization policies and their impact on homelessness?
So there's been a couple of studies. We just finished a very brief study that we're working to expand, but there was a study back in 2000, and they looked at data from 2007 to 2020. And what they found was that, contrary to popular belief or misinformation, that homelessness does not decrease when criminalization is a practice in a community. And they looked at 100 cities across the country. And what they found was that it actually increased slightly, 1%. That was a study done by the University of Texas at Austin, and also the University of Central Florida. That study didn't find increase in unsheltered homelessness, but it did find an increase in homelessness overall. We just did a study on the 320 cities, a survey, a look at the point in time counts in those cities. Of the 320 cities who have recently introduced criminalization ordinances, what we found is exactly the same thing. There was not a reduction, there was a slight increase, a 1% increase again. But what we found this time is that there was an increase also in the unsheltered population, about 2%. There's also been other studies, and these were studies done by the medical community. And what they found is that when you involuntarily move people, it does tend to have negative outcomes on their health. Lifespans are shortened. There is an increase in disease for those people that are involuntarily moved. And then finally, there was another study that also looked at, again, mortality rates. There was a study by JAMA, the Journal of Medical, and there was also another study that was recently done. I believe that study was, again, the University of Central Florida. Healthcare for the Homeless Council has also done research on this, and we find that definitely the outcomes for people when it comes to their medical situations and their morbidity is actually worse when communities are moved involuntarily. And then there's many other studies, but we can certainly say that from the top line studies that we've seen, criminalization does not reduce homelessness at all. It actually increases homelessness. And when we look at how we got to that 30% increase, I would suggest that part of the increase is also due to the increased criminalization. We're doing additional research to look at the other issues that are involved in criminalization. For instance, we know that people experiencing homelessness stay in jail longer. We know that people experiencing homelessness, only 13% of the crimes that are created, homeless people or people experiencing homelessness are arrested for are violent crimes. The other 87%, overwhelming majority, are these quality of life crimes. So the idea that people are somehow a threat to people in society is wrong. If you look at the numbers, there's an overrepresentation. This is probably not a news flash for people of color being arrested due to criminalization that comes from the Bureau of Prisons. So there's a lot of data out there, and I could go on and on. I know there were studies in California that looked at the length of sentences and the number of people who are stopped and the number of people who are stopped but not arrested, overwhelmingly people of color. So a lot of data related to the criminalization.
So I appreciate that. And I want to come back to some of those issues that you raised. But before I jump into those, let me, Tristia, ask if maybe you could talk a little bit. Most of the questions I've asked so far have been sort of big picture, what is the impact on homelessness overall? People trying to solve homelessness, sort of, is this good policy sorts of questions. And some of Donald's response just now started getting into a little bit more of the micro as well. What is the impact on the individuals who are actually on the street? And I know that you and your team, are working regularly with a bunch of those folks. When you see criminalization policies, what does that mean for the clients you serve, for the people who are in their cars, in shelters, on the streets? How does that play out in their lives?
Thank you. Well, so I agree with what you've heard so far about, some of the reasons why the policy making is responsive to complaints about visibly unhoused people, rather than policies designed to solve homelessness. And the research demonstrates that those policies fail, and the lived experience of people who are at the tail end of those policies also demonstrates that failure. And it's experienced in the form of really acute harms, dismantling of what they know to be their homes, loss of their property, loss of their families or community, and then barriers that are imposed upon them for surviving in public space that make it difficult for them to access housing or other resources that they may need, from public benefits to food and medicine for that particular day. Here's how it could play out. For example, there is a very common type of policy restricting sheltering in vehicles. And in fact, when I was at the National Homelessness Law Center, we did a series of studies over the course of many years. We started in 2006 and looked at a core set of 187 cities across the country and reported on the existence of some of the types of laws that you've heard described today: camping bans, sit-lie bans that literally restrict holding certain postures in public space, panhandling, and other things that are considered, within kind of the core set of criminalization ordinances enforced at the local level. What we found since 2006 is that those laws increased along with increasing unsheltered homelessness and presumably complaints by residents about unsheltered homelessness. The response has been enforcement of laws, including restrictions on using certain forms of shelter, even in the absence of other shelter alternatives. Vehicles are a common form of either housing or shelter that are utilized by an increasing number of families, people with disabilities, and others who lack better alternatives. And under this increasing body of ordinances that restrict that type of use, people may lose their vehicles. And in addition to losing then the shelter, along with all of the property that is kept in those vehicles, they may be imposed fines for that loss, the tow that occurred would be a fine assessed to that individual if they attempt to get that vehicle back. The storage of the vehicle would be something that would be imposed upon them as a fine if they attempt to get that vehicle back. That would be the case even if inside of that vehicle is proof of their identity, the things that they need in order to access their medical care or other services. And that type of seizure and financial penalty, interruption in services is all done without use of the criminal legal system. If you add the criminal legal system, as they do in some locations, and then arrest a person for utilizing that form of shelter, in addition to the financial penalties, now they have a criminal record and may lose their liberty for some period of time. These laws are punished generally up to a period of about 6 months. And in some jurisdictions around the country, people are doing real time for violating survival crimes. But even just the arrest with the impact of the record, financial penalties that are associated with the arrest and incarceration are just additional barriers to ever accessing housing or infrastructure that's needed to help people be self-sufficient.
Thank you. There was a Supreme Court decision that I'm sure much of our audience is at least somewhat familiar with, the Grants Pass decision. It was a little over a year ago. I'm wondering, Anne, if you can talk a little bit about, what was that decision? Why is it important? How does it play into the conversation we're having today?
Yep. So I'll preface this again by saying I am not an attorney. I am going to put this in terms that make sense for my non-attorney brain, and then I would ask Tristia and others to weigh in if I get anything not quite right. So the Supreme Court case is technically called the City of Grants Pass v. Gloria Johnson. The City of Grants Pass is a small city in Oregon. Gloria Johnson was a woman who was experiencing homelessness within the City of Grants Pass. And the Supreme Court decision happened last year in 2024, in June, late June of 2024. And at its core, it basically allows jurisdictions to punish people through civil or criminal means. So that could be a fine or an arrest, so civil or criminal punishment for sleeping outside, even when there is no shelter available. Prior to the Grants Pass decision, at least in the Ninth Circuit, which is largely on the West Coast of the United States, a Ninth Circuit court decision required that jurisdictions would have to offer shelter or have shelter available in order to fine or ticket somebody or arrest somebody for, sleeping in public. But this sort of negated that Ninth Circuit decision, and then also applies to the rest of the country. So now it is not considered cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment to fine, ticket, or arrest somebody simply for sleeping. And honestly, sleeping was defined in very broad ways. If you have a blanket, if you have a pillow, if you're resting on a park bench, it's interesting to watch how the arguments sort of played out around what actually is covered. But the Supreme Court decided that it is not cruel and unusual punishment to apply civil or criminal penalties to people who are living outside, even if there's no shelter available. So that is sort of the crux of the Grants Pass case.
Thank you. So let me ask a follow-up. Maybe Tristia, I'll direct this at you, but Donald, you may want to jump in on this as well. Anybody feel free. But so that as Anne said, the Grants Pass decision held that it was not a violation of the Eighth Amendment, right? The cruel and unusual punishment to have these policies, but it left open the possibility that these policies might violate some other part of the federal constitution or state constitutions or other laws in various ways. So can you talk just a little bit about, to the extent you're aware of, are there other avenues that people are using from a legal perspective to challenge these policies other than the Eighth Amendment at this point?
Yes, and and what I'd say is that even to say that the Eighth Amendment is no longer available to challenge these types of policies is too
Too
broad.
broad.
All that was,
Yeah.
looked at was the cruel and unusual punishments clause within the Eighth Amendment. There's also an excessive fines clause that looks at whether or not a fine or a penalty is grossly disproportionate to the act that is being penalized. So that is still, at least potentially a viable argument. The Supreme Court and the composition of that court and the likelihood of prevailing on any of these claims before the Supreme Court, I think, is an open question. But what is technically available post Johnson still is an argument that these laws violate the excessive fines clause of the Eighth Amendment. Then frequently, as I mentioned, and there are a lot of other harms that people experience beyond property seizure and barriers to housing access. I mean, there are acute harms. It can be deadly enforcement of these types of ordinances. And as a result of the property seizure, Fourth Amendment rights to be free from unreasonable seizures of property or persons are implicated by these types of laws. The 14th Amendment that guarantees due process, and that could be procedural due process, like some amount of notice before deprivation of property or deprivation of any other type of right, some ability to challenge the deprivation of that right in the form of a hearing, for example, is implicated by criminalization law enforcement, as well as what we call, substantive due process, like, for example, a right to be free from state-created danger. Is the government acting affirmatively to put a person in a worse position than the government found them, and putting them in a position where they might suffer a known or obvious risk of serious bodily harm? That has been successfully argued to stop sweeps, for example, during inclement weather periods in at least the Western United States. All of those arguments are still available along with a whole host of others. And this, of course, says nothing about state constitutions, which are untouched by the Johnson decision.
And might actually be politically more possible in some instances. Donald, you were going to jump in?
Well, and that was the point I was going to add to the conversation, is that one of the good things is that these are local decisions for the most part, statewide, citywide ordinances, and they can be challenged at the state and local level. And we have seen successful challenges. One in, I think it was Mission Viejo, California, hopefully I'm not wrong about that, but challenged an ordinance on the 14th Amendment. But a lot of communities have actually been very creative. I don't know if we'll talk about some of the most egregious forms of these ordinances that we see in places like Kentucky and Tennessee, among others. There's some really bad ordinances. And I do also believe that there is still a lot of opening even at the Supreme Court level, because one of the arguments, and Tristia, please support me on this because I'm not a lawyer either, was that part of the reason why there was opposition was because people experiencing homelessness were not a protected class, or were not a class at all. And so there has been some movement on making people experiencing homelessness a protected class. So I think that's another angle that some of the disability rights groups are considering, looking at amending the Civil Rights Amendment to make homelessness a protected class as well. So that's another avenue. I think that's an option for communities.
And if I may just add one quick side note to this Supreme Court conversation, one of the interesting things that happened as a result of the case itself is that I think more than 1,000 people signed off on or submitted briefs to the court in support of people experiencing homelessness. And a subgroup of those people were researchers. And it's been a good place to go for, like, we basically crowdsourced a lot of research and really rich material about what works to end homelessness and what the policy implications are. And the Alliance, if somebody could put some of our research briefs in the chat, the Alliance has sort of gathered those up and done some analysis based on what the researchers said in support of Gloria Johnson in that case. And so that's just a good resource for folks who are looking for legal resources.
Great. Tono, can you talk a little bit? What are some of the most egregious examples that you've seen around the country recently?
I think if I would start with the Kentucky ordinance that actually makes it people can utilize stand your ground principles. If you remember this from the Trayvon Martin case in Florida, the stand your ground allows you to use force up to and including deadly force if a person is on your property experiencing homelessness. In Tennessee, it's a felony if you are on public property and homeless with up to a penalty of up to 6 years in jail. Those are two of the worst, but there's a lot of really bad public policy that we see in California. And I'm going to forget again, I think it was Mission Viejo. There was actually an ordinance that would fine you for actually helping homeless people. Mm-hmm. So we've gone from the extreme to the ridiculous when it comes to these ordinances. Those are two, and I'm sure our other two panelists can actually come up with other ones, but those are the two that kind of really stand out to me. It actually, in the Kentucky case, it to me invites violence. And it opens the door for people to harm vulnerable people. And we already see enough of that right now. So that to me is and all of these, I would say, kind of dehumanize people and open the door for people to treat them in a way that's less than compassionate and dangerous in many cases.
Here in California, I know we just passed a bill that would, assuming the governor signs it, would limit fines and penalties for folks who are assisting those who are homeless in certain ways. And there's been conversations, although I don't think they've gone anywhere yet, about something you mentioned earlier, which is the possibility of having folks who are homeless be a protected class, at least under state law, although that hasn't come to fruition yet.
Using the vulnerable victims laws in the state.
Yeah. Were you going to jump in on something else, Don? Look like you might.
Well, one thing I wanted to add, though, is a lot of this, I think, the Grants Pass case gave a permission structure to municipalities to kind of go down this path. But I think equally as impactful after Grants Pass or during Grants Pass as well was the support of progressive leaders that promoted this kind of direction for our country, including the governor of California and now the president of the United States, which I know we'll talk about. I think it is really, really dangerous for our elected leaders to actually go down a path that places people in a position where they're less than, and there are people that are looked at as criminals and people that are dehumanized in our community. I think it really sets up a dangerous precedent. And I think that is one thing that the idea of criminalizing people has been around for a long time. So anti-vagrancy laws have been in the country for all of our history. There were criminalization laws that really started after dehumanizing poor people in the 80s. We've seen that. Tristia talked about the 187 communities even back in 2006 or 2010. I think you did the study. Those have always been around. What we haven't had is our elected leaders, especially at the top of a state or federal government, promoting that idea. That's to me very new. So I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, I want to come back to you about the federal aspect of that, but Tristia, let me ask you about that in California. What have you seen post Grants Pass, related perhaps to Governor Newsom's order mostly for state agencies, although it was a bit broader than that. What have you seen here in California in the last year or so?
I think what we've seen in California looks a lot like what we've seen in other parts of the country, in that a green light apparently has been given to local governments to enact camping bans, trespass laws, other ordinances aimed at removing and displacing visibly unhoused people from public space using some form of penalty, whether it be criminal or civil. In Silicon Valley or Santa Clara County, where I work, there are a number of laws that were enacted recently. I believe the National Homelessness Law Center is tracking, perhaps with others here, the number of laws nationwide that have been enacted for the first time or amended post Johnson. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's something like 300 nationwide and
320 nationwide.
320. Well, we contributed, some of those to that tally. Valley Water enacted a camping ban, which is a quasi-governmental agency that manages the waterways along 300 miles of creeks throughout the county. And then the adjacent municipalities also enacted camping bans. And the patchwork of those laws leaves no lawful place where people can live if they don't have indoor alternatives, and those indoor alternatives don't exist. Also, what we're seeing, and I know we'll probably talk later about the Cicero Institute and its model policy and approach to visible homelessness and homelessness policy, and how that is driving certain bad policies like what we see in Kentucky, really explicitly violent policies that we're not seeing here in the same way in California. But there are aspects of those policies: increased institutionalization of people through involuntary detentions of people with either mental health disabilities or substance abuse disabilities, related disabilities, and also defunding of housing, directing our housing resources toward temporary settings and directing people who are at the tail end of these criminalization ordinances into those institutions or those temporary settings at huge taxpayer expense. That certainly is happening here in Santa Clara County at the municipal level. That characterizes the city of San Jose's policymaking, in my view.
So Tristia, I'm concerned. People keep mentioning, or I keep mentioning, I'm going to get back to that, or want to ask you more about that. I'm worried we're going to run out of time. So can you talk a little bit more about Cicero since you mentioned it? Because I want to make sure the audience is aware who that is and what that's about.
Yeah, Cicero Institute is, and I am not going to be the best person really to articulate ultimately how it is functioning now, but it started some years ago by Joe Lonsdale, who is, and I don't mean to be flippant, but this phrase tech bro is a phrase, in popular culture. This is a tech bro think tank that has a vested financial interest in the escalation of private prisons, in gathering our data and surveilling poor and unhoused people. And they developed a model policy that you can find on its website that encourages enforcement of criminalization laws, defunding of housing for temporary alternatives, and use of the larger governmental power, because it started off as a state model bill, state power to pressure localities to enforce criminalization ordinances or suffer loss of financial resources from the state. And they seem to really be taking hold across the nation. And that's where I would kick it to my colleagues.
Yeah, that's spot on, Tristia. I would just add that with this administration in the White House and access that sort of tech billionaires have inside of the administration, I think that they're just sort of gaining more and more power. And we see that playing out in policies. I'm going to specifically talk about HUD policies right now. Politico last night dropped an article that basically indicates that the new notice of funding opportunity for the Continuum of Care program, which is the nation's largest grants program for people experiencing homelessness. It's basically like the backbone of homelessness response across the country. that they are in effect going to be cutting a very large chunk of permanent housing that is currently operating with people living in it. They're going to go from about 87% of the portfolio being permanent housing programs down to 30%, a maximum of 30% of the portfolio being permanent housing programs. That will likely mean that about 170,000 people who are formerly homeless and in permanent housing programs because they have a disabling condition, or they're a family with kids, or they're a senior or a veteran, they will lose their housing and the supportive services that goes along with it. And, I'm not going to opine on the exact reason why folks like Cicero are pushing this, but it's very clear that they have a lot of access in this administration and influence in this administration because we are seeing policies show up now that are directly related to the work that Cicero has been ramping up over the last few years.
And I would just add one other name, because I think people may be familiar with Joe Lonsdale, but the other co-founder of the Cicero Institute was Peter Thiel. And so Peter Thiel is one of the highest ranking, most utilized advisors to the president. And, I know we'll talk about some of the other things that the president has done. And a lot of it includes language around criminalization. Actually, he's basically demanding that communities utilize criminalization strategies in order to get funding in some cases.
Okay, let's move to that, Donald. Can you talk a little bit more about what has been done in terms of the executive order and what else has been done at the presidential level, and maybe a little bit, particularly for the West Coast folks on the call, about what's been happening in DC in particular, not the DC politics side, but the DC city side on these issues?
So a couple of things. The executive order in July was called the Ending Crime and Disorder on American Streets, and it specifically talked about cleaning up cities by reducing homelessness in the cities. But it also had contradictory language about using Medicaid, which was being cut at the very same time. But it really was designed to first make the statement or create the narrative that homelessness was a crime and that people who are homeless were criminals. And in order to reduce crime, and we talked about that with some of the elected officials, what's behind their decision to move in this direction. So the president specifically said that he was going to move people experiencing homelessness initially. In DC, what we saw was a influx of military individuals who worked in the military, the National Guard, from multiple cities came into DC. There was an expanded presence of ICE. And honestly, what really was kind of the largest outcome. Now I will say that people experiencing homelessness were terrified. And it did cause services and service providers in DC to scramble to find alternative placements. The city of DC did create more units for people experiencing homelessness to go to. There were multiple raids of encampments where people, as Tristia talked about, belongings were disposed of. So there was this big crackdown. People were accosted daily, their belongings thrown away, sometimes multiple times in a day as I talked to people on the street. So it really caused a lot of angst in the community, a lot of fear, again, among the homeless population. What it turned out to be, in my opinion, and Ann is here, and Ann was really very instrumental in the middle of this. We both did outreach that we probably haven't done in decades. But what we saw was, in my opinion, what I saw, especially the first few nights, was what was framed as a crackdown on homeless homelessness was really a crackdown on immigration. So we saw a huge immigration presence. We did see, again, people experiencing homelessness being accosted, but what we didn't see, and what I think the fear, especially because of the statements by the press secretary about people being disappeared, basically people being moved out of the city, we didn't actually see that in DC. We did see people being arrested if there were fines or other issues that were illegal. They would be arrested, but typically just people experiencing homelessness were moved along. Some went to neighboring cities during the day or during the evening and came back during the day. But we didn't see this wholesale. We thought we'd see the introduction, as was in Project 2025, of detention camps. Now, we haven't seen that. And if Ann has other information, I'd love to hear that. But we did see a disruption of the daily lives of people, a palpable fear that they had to endure, their belongings being regularly taken, but we did not see the disappearance of people, not to my knowledge. We didn't see people being put in detention camps. And that's how it materialized in DC. It's calmed now quite a bit. We still see the presence, but at $1 million or so a day, I think the number is, they're picking up trash, and they're in parks. They're not in the places where crime, and crime was already going down in DC. And again, homelessness is not a crime. I don't know if I can explain it any more than that, but Ann, I would love for you to weigh in on the executive order as well. I'm sorry, I'm not taking over facilitator duties. I just know.
No, it's all great. It's all great. I've got a million follow-up questions, but Ann, jump in, please.
Oh, no, I agree with Donald's characterization of what was happening here in the district and what continues to happen here in the district. There is, we have a continued very visible presence by the National Guard and other federal police officers. And to answer the question in the chat, when we say moved along, I don't think that people experiencing homelessness were necessarily moving themselves. They were being forced to move from whatever location, especially locations, frankly, that the president drives by. They seem to be pretty targeted in between the White House and the Kennedy Center, or other routes that the president takes to get to various places. Those encampments were largely cleared, and people were moved along, but they were not going voluntarily.
So let me ask Ann about another aspect of the administration's rhetoric and the executive order, which is a heavy focus on involuntary institutionalization of folks as being sort of a centerpiece of what they're saying should happen and is needed. That is, as you well know, that's very contrary to sort of what the best evidence shows is effective, a housing first, harm reduction sorts of models that we know work. But can you talk a little bit more about what they are saying in that respect, what we're seeing, and how that contrasts with what you think we should be doing?
Sure. So the executive order that was issued in July that Donald has referenced included language around this idea of involuntary commitment, that communities are going to be expected to have more robust involuntary commitment rules. Right now, like here in Washington, D.C., it's called an FD12. In California, I think it's a 5150. Like there are, in many communities, there are already people who are trained to do involuntary commitments if there is a health or safety, a very specific health or safety issue that's aligned with local laws. So the expectation, I think, through that executive order is that and the rhetoric that has been used by the president is that he would like to get back to sort of and this is his words, not mine, like asylums, right? Where people are involuntarily committed rather than receiving services in the community, for example. But I think it's really important for folks who are on this call to know that on its face, that is, I'll use the word disingenuous for this for this audience. It is disingenuous to say that we need to ramp up involuntary commitment, because there are plenty of people who are experiencing homelessness that are have been waiting for a long time to be able to access services like supports for recovery, like mental health services, job training services, all sorts of other services that they would actually like to be able to access and can't. And in fact, the reconciliation bill that was passed by this Congress and signed by the president earlier this year cuts Medicaid dollars for exactly the kinds of folks who are waiting to get services. It actually shrinks the pot. So to be able to square those doesn't really, if you have some critical thinking skills, squaring those two things does not actually work out. And then the other thing that I would say, let's just say there were some resources. There aren't, but let's just say there were resources for substance use treatment, for mental health treatment. The question that I always have is, where do you think people are going to go after that? We still don't have enough affordable housing for people at the lowest incomes in this country. And the data that we have is overwhelmingly points to the lack of affordable housing as the underlying cause of homelessness. So to make to institutionalize people or to force people into services, even if there were the resources available, without having housing that's affordable to them when they come out of those services, seems like it is really just putting people into a really damaging cycle. So I think that there's a lot of problems with the approach, again, that the administration has talked about in these executive orders, and that is now showing up in actual policy and program design mechanisms that are administered by the federal government, like the Continuum of Care program and others.
And I would say that is the biggest takeaway when you talk about criminalization and involuntary placement, and hit on what people need to take away from this conversation. If you don't take away anything else, criminalization does not solve homelessness. People are still homeless after they leave a jail cell, after they leave involuntary placement. Housing is what we need to end homelessness. And these myopic solutions do not do that in any way. In fact, people, once they're put in jail with mental health issues, very seldom get the kind of treatment that they would need to be able to address those issues. So I think that is really a core takeaway from what we're trying to say today.
Thank you for that, Tristia. I want to see if you can talk a little bit about something Donald mentioned earlier in the DC context, which is the impact of the immigration enforcement that we're seeing and the fear that that's causing in various communities. What are you seeing in that respect in Northern California?
Well, we're certainly seeing terror in Northern California, and I'll talk a little bit about how it's showing up with the population that we serve directly. In Santa Clara County, about half of our unhoused population is Latino. And of the renter population, there are similar rates of very low income renters who struggle to pay rent every single month. What we found after the new administration took power and after the ICE raids began, we had fewer people coming to us for eviction defense services. And some people described for us a fear to go to court at all to defend their eviction cases, which would be necessary to preserve their housing and avoid a judgment against them, which could be a barrier to future housing, because they feared engaging at all with any system. And these are people who are undocumented themselves or people who are in mixed status households and who may not be undocumented themselves, but have loved ones who are just opting out entirely from programs. Similarly, we see people opting out entirely of programs that can help them. One of the great things about where I live is that we do have really robust rental assistance programs. So people who are struggling to pay the cost of rent, and we can talk about, as a system, are we just transferring wealth to landlords? Yes, but at the same time, it helps keep people in housing, and we have to prevent homelessness in order to solve the crisis that exists now. Those systems, which can provide direct support to people without any inquiry into their immigration status, does require some identification of who you are, entry into a system, some amount of data collection. People wanted to opt out entirely of that program because they feared any involvement with systems. Moving to the encampment sweeps context, recently the city of San Jose conducted the largest sweep that it had in about a decade. This is 400 plus people living mostly in vehicles within an area of parks in downtown San Jose. There was no effort to do Spanish language outreach. And what that led to was a lack of information to particularly vulnerable encampment residents. And that lack of information, that information void, was filled by misinformation. So rumors of anytime there's somebody knocking on your door, do not answer because that could be ICE. That meant doors were not opened to would-be outreach workers who were offering some form of services. And we see it play out in the downstream effects. Now, monolingual Spanish speakers who are residing at that camp, who theoretically would have been eligible for the hotel programming that was offered to other residents, never had an opportunity to enroll in that programming before the services filled up, because there are always more people than services that are offered. And they are now, moving from place to place. And God bless them. Hopefully they can continue to do that indefinitely. But with the new patchwork of laws making it illegal to live in your vehicles anywhere in our region, they are very likely to lose the homes that they've had for years that are functional homes with working bathrooms, kitchens, and places where they live with their families, go to work from, take care of each other within. And that is all in part a function of the impact of immigration rates and immigration policy.
Thank you. Anne, I want to ask you a little bit about the racial dimensions of these issues that we're talking about, and other folks can weigh in on this as well. But most of our audience is probably aware, and I know you all are, about the huge racial disparities in who is experiencing homelessness and also who is having encounters with the criminal justice system. And I know the criminal side of criminalization, it can also be civil, but just thinking about how those disparities sort of interplay with one another, with interaction with the criminal justice system and with homelessness. What role does race play in what we're seeing here with respect to criminalization, both on the choosing to engage in these policies and put these policies in place, but also then sort of how it plays out for the individuals who are experiencing these policies?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that we've touched on a lot of how race plays into criminalization throughout this conversation, but I'll just be explicit about a few things. People of color, especially Black people, are overrepresented in the population of people experiencing homelessness in this country, as are LGBTQ people and people with disabilities. Marginalized people tend to be overrepresented or suffer homelessness disproportionately. And they're also the same people who are over-policed and who are in communities that are over-policed. So there is absolutely a sort of overlap when we talk about who is targeted or who suffers when there are these types of laws that criminalize people for like existing outside. And I think I think it was Tristia said earlier, what happens to people is that, you know, let's say you're fined, but you're not gonna be able to pay a fine. If you're living in a tent outside, paying a fine is a ridiculous notion just on its face, right? Like, why are you gonna who expects you to pay a $500 fine? If you had $500, you would go stay in a hotel or rent an apartment. Like, there's just some basic things that just don't make sense about that approach generally. But let's say those fines rack up like they did for many people in Grants Pass. They rack up, then you get a bench warrant, and then you get picked up and you suddenly now have a criminal record. And that criminal record makes it harder for you to sign a lease, to get an apartment, even if you would be able to find one, or if you get a housing choice voucher and you could find one, it makes it harder to get a job because now you have a criminal record. And they're the same people that are subject to discrimination, both in employment circles as well as in housing circles. We know housing discrimination is pretty rampant, just generally. It is really significant for people of color, for communities of color. And it just makes everybody's life so much harder, especially for people who are already marginalized on the front end of this whole process. So the intersections between marginalization and race and homelessness and who gets criminalized and the outcomes that they have after being criminalized, I think can't be overlooked or understated.
Great. Thank you. Well, not great, but thank you for sharing that.
Correct.
Correct. Yes. So, Don, I have a question for you, and you've already touched on some aspects of this. And you mentioned the protected class issues earlier. You also mentioned some sort of disparities in violence rates. You know, the folks on the street actually have lower rates of serious violence than, say, folks who are housed and by various measures. But one thing that I find pops up a lot when we start having questions about protected class is issues of hate crimes. Can you talk a little bit about what we are seeing with respect to folks who are living on the streets with respect to hate crimes and how that's playing out currently?
Sure. We've actually looked at violence against people experiencing homelessness over a 20-year period. And many of the crimes we found were what you would consider hate crimes. People did that crime, they perpetrated the activity based on the person's status as a homeless person. So sometimes it was gangs. Most of the time it was young people between the ages of 18 and 35. At one point, there were more crimes against people experiencing homelessness that could be considered hate crimes than the rest of the protected classes combined. And that was a study that we did with law firms that looked at press reports of violence and then investigated those to make sure that they could be considered hate crimes. So not an exact science. And the goal was to push the Justice Department to take a deeper look at those kinds of crimes. I think over that period, there were over 2,000 crimes against people experiencing homelessness. About a quarter of those actually resulted in some of the most egregious forms of harm, the worst possible crimes against people experiencing homelessness. So we've done that for 20 years. The last study, we found about 51 of these instances. We just started the research for 2023, 2024, again, a 2-year period. We found already in the first year, 151 incidents. Now we'll have to filter those. We'll have to see, follow up to make sure the information was accurate. But the crimes in the 1 year were 3 times as many as the previous 2-year period, and the most in any one period. So we know that when people are criminalized, when their camps are raided, when they're made to be less than, we do see an incidence, a higher rate of people committing crimes against them. The last study, we saw more serial killers that were targeting people experiencing homelessness. And this is one of the unspoken dangers of raiding encampments. What happens to people when many times people are in encampments because they can't afford housing, they're forced into homelessness, but they see the encampment as a community, a place where there's relative safety because of numbers. And so people go into those encampments. Now, when you raid that encampment, you scatter people. So people are more isolated, and the people who regularly commit these crimes do it because they're victims of opportunity. So an isolated person in a doorway by themselves is a much easier target than a group of people in an encampment. So that, while we don't encourage encampments at all, we know what happens when people are scattered. There's some other things we didn't talk about, but the hate crimes against people experiencing homelessness are real. And we've again, this is not new. We've seen people that were considered vagrants or transients always be high on the list of people that are victimized. But this is very alarming to me, what I've seen so far. Now, I have a group of interns right now that are working to make sure that that information is consistent. But we certainly have seen it over the last 20 years, and we've seen it ramp up over the last 20 years. This is a lot worse than we've ever seen. So we're hoping that when we scrub this, that those numbers go way down. But I think we'll definitely see an increase in the number of hate crimes just in the 1 year data that we've already looked at. So it is the reason why we have promoted the protected class status, unfortunately. And what it would mean is that if you did this, if you committed this crime against a person experiencing homelessness, we know that the majority of the people that are unsheltered in this country are seniors. They're 55 years of age and older. So another segment of the population that is regularly victimized. So what would happen is the penalties, and some people may not be in favor of this. There will be enhanced penalties if you decided to make the decision to harm someone simply because they were homeless. Now, there has been pushback on that, I will say, and just to be completely transparent, and pushback I agree with. When we go to groups like the Center on the Leadership Center on Civil and Human Rights and the ADL, they have been opposed to it, especially with the current makeup of the Supreme Court, because it would have to, if you change the Civil Rights Act, it would have to be changed by Congress and then the Supreme Court as well. And so we don't want to open up the Civil Rights Act to this Supreme Court under any circumstances. So we will be pushing for more localized victimization and hate crimes laws in the near future. And a lot of our work is going to be localized because of the fact that criminalization, again, is a more local issue. And although there is federal legislation that the Law Center has actually helped introduce, the Gloria Johnson Act is actually a bill that's been introduced in Congress at our current time.
So I'm going to ask you all in a moment about what folks on the call can do to help and what folks should be thinking about as they push forward. But before I get there, I want to ask another question, and a number of you have already touched on aspects of this, but I'm curious if you have additional thoughts, which is if criminalization is not the answer, what is the answer? What should we be doing? Where should our policies be focusing? I think, Anne, at the outset, you mentioned the need to be more strategic in our decisions and sort of thinking about this than people are currently being. I know it's been mentioned by some of you, we need more federal resources, more focus on affordable housing. But what if you just had to say, maybe each of you briefly, like what is the core of where you'd like to see the focus be instead of this focus on criminalization?
I'm happy to start. So I think you're right. There has to be advocacy and action at both the federal level and at the state and local levels in order for us to end homelessness as we know it. At the federal level, there has to be investments in affordable housing, and specifically housing that is affordable to people at the lowest incomes. Very often a developer cannot make an affordable a project that is affordable to people at like 0 to 15% of the area median income pencil out. So they go they go higher on the income scale, so that they can sort of make the entire project work. And that is not going to be fixed by the market. It is only going to be fixed by federal investments, to make sure that those kinds of units can have, for example, subsidies attached to them that make those units affordable to people at the very lowest incomes. So we need federal action, and that is long term. At the local level, we obviously also want housing and services to be front of mind for elected officials as they are doing their resource allocation plans every year. But there are also interim strategies that can help keep people as safe and healthy as possible. And I mean people experiencing homelessness and the community that they live in. There are interim strategies to help serve people, get them off the street, and get the services that they need while we are waiting for these longer term investments to play out. And I hope that somebody has the link and can put it in the chat. The Alliance has a toolkit and paper that sort of lays out what we think these interim strategies could be at the local level, so that elected leaders have something to point to show that they are taking this problem seriously and that they are taking the needs of both housed and unhoused people in their community into account when they're making these funding allocation decisions or resource allocation decisions.
You anticipated my next question, Anne, which was about those resources. So I appreciate you flagging that. Hopefully we can throw that in the chat. Donald, what are your thoughts?
So, everything that Ann said is spot on, and I would agree 100%. I will talk about some specific policies. We know that the studies suggest that the most effective intervention for people experiencing homelessness is subsidized housing. So we certainly need to increase the subsidized housing, and it should be affordable to everyone. But I think there are some interim steps as well that because of the shrinking federal funding for services, I think we also need localized solutions that may be accomplished with the resources in the local community. So I would really encourage governors and mayors and cities to look at some of the resources that they have at hand right now. And the one solution that I think has a lot of bipartisan support, it won't solve homelessness, but it will make an impact, and that's adaptive reuse. And that's taking abandoned buildings, whether they be old shopping centers or schools or even malls and hotels, and transforming those into affordable housing. Tens of thousands of units exist in every city in this country. And there are a number of funding sources available. It actually, in a study we did with the Pew Institute, that kind of housing can be developed quicker and more cost effective than new builds. So it isn't perfect for everything, but for every community, but it certainly can make an impact. And again, it is a bipartisan issue. So we have a bill that we've worked with Congress to introduce at the federal level, but we've also seen states like Texas and Maryland, two very opposite states when it comes to their political leanings, introduce adaptive reuse. So it's a bipartisan solution. There's also many of us on this call worked on the McKinney-Vento Title V Act, which would make federal property available for the use as homeless shelters. So those are a couple of things, but I do think where we missed the ball quite a bit is if we can't produce affordable housing, we have to make the housing affordable. And what I mean in that is that we typically, and we have done this for years, overlook the impact of income and income support. We've seen some fantastic direct income support programs. We saw that with the stimulus. We saw it with in places in California that provided direct cash benefits to individuals. So we need to look at those kinds of solutions as well. And certainly anti-criminalization. We do have a 10-point plan on our website. I'm not as good as Ann. I won't be able to get to the website and put it in, but I'll make sure I share it with you guys later. But we have a 10-point plan that looks at 10 different ways that communities can use their own resources to address homelessness, again, as the federal resources sink. But the other thing that everyone can do is get involved in the political process in your community and utilize whatever sphere of influence you have to make sure those local elected officials are doing what you ask them to do because they work for you and you don't work for them. And so people have to get involved in the political process. Not enough people are doing that in this country. That is really the way we affect change. We have to force change on the people that may be reluctant or driven by some of the other things we talked about earlier. So those are the things that we can do in addition to everything that Ann talked about. We all have a role that we can play, and we have to exercise that role. It is critical. We are at a tipping point. The arc of justice bends slowly, but in this particular time, I'm worried that it may break, and so we have to be a part of the resistance to make sure that we can affect change in this country.
Tristia, thoughts on what you'd like to see, focus on if it's not criminalization?
Yes, well, I would offer support for what has been shared and also emphasize the point that there are a number of ways that people can get involved. And so what I'll highlight as a potential strategy is the ground game. Supporting grassroots movements of people and really focusing on local infrastructure is a way that you can get involved. I mean, as we heard, in terms of the dollars and funding for affordable housing, that is coming from the federal government, state government. The large, deep pockets is how we're ultimately going to fund housing. But the criminalization ordinances are often passed at the very local level. And what those lawmakers are responding to is their local constituencies. They hear complaints from people about visible homelessness. We need to make sure that they are hearing from unhoused people and people at risk of housing displacement about what their experiences are, what their needs are, and from neighbors and allies who can support them in those efforts. And then building out from there, of course, also those people who are always inherently at risk of housing displacement and community displacement. And I'm referring to extremely low income renters. So some of what that can look like for the average person is participate in your neighborhood associations or find out where there are people within your sphere of influence, as Dawn said, who can participate in neighborhood associations. Go to town halls. Don't just wait for final votes at city council, because by then the die has largely been cast. Go and participate in local governments in the lead up to, and not just yourself representing your own interests as perhaps homeowner or a member of your congregation, for example. Be a conduit for people who are often disenfranchised and not connected with government, and provide, a safe passage for them into the belly of the beast, the infrastructure. For example, call upon local bodies to hold listening sessions, and then use your car, your resources, relationships to bring people into those spaces who may otherwise not access those spaces. And I'm referring to people who may be, hiding in invisible encampments and would not normally wander into City Hall unless there were a safe opportunity for them to do so with allies supporting them in that effort. Those types of things can produce a counter narrative that we can hold our governments, local governments, accountable to, and it's another way to in coordination with policy advocacy at the higher levels for funding, to ensure that we have policies that are actually driven toward solving the problem before us rather than hiding the symptoms of it.
Right. So we are getting close to the end. We have about 5 minutes left here. And you've answered a number of the questions that have popped up from the audience, but I do just want to tee up a couple that I don't think we've touched on yet and get your responses, some of which are a bit more particular. One is, are there any creative options for forms of ID for unhoused or undocumented folks? I'm thinking library cards or medical cards. Anybody have thoughts on that?
I think
I'll
those are
answer that. Oh, go ahead, Don. Go ahead,
No,
Don.
you go ahead. You go ahead. I'll go ahead.
This is an unsatisfying answer because I don't recall the specifics, but I do know that there have been communities who have grappled with this well. Some of what I'm vaguely recalling, I know the National Homelessness Law Center has some of this information, and perhaps others do, and I should just stop. But yes, the short answer is yes, there are things that can be done.
One of the things that's been really effective is there are groups that's all they do. They help people through monthly events get their information. So there is a group in Florida called iDignity. And what they do, their only mission is to make sure people can get their ID, because it can be very complicated. So there are absolutely a number of groups that do that. There's another group in Maryland, I can't think of that name, but I would look up iDignity, and they have some really important ways to do it. But library cards, voter identification is another form of identification that people can use. But of course, you have to get to the voter education stage. Those are a couple of things. Many shelters actually require badging at this point. I know that in Cincinnati, the shelters do have badges that they require. I don't know. I think that's as many. I know that's not a satisfying answer either, but those are a couple of things. I know there was also in Maryland, there was the License Bureau actually did outreach to some of the shelters to help people through the identification process during COVID. So that's another option, maybe looking at your governmental agencies.
At Inner City Law Center, I know we do a regular, what we call a vital documents clinic in the Skid Row neighborhood.
Yes, I remember you telling me that.
All right, I could keep going with lots of questions, and there are a few more here. We are very close to the end, though. I can ask another question, but before I do that, let me just see, is there anything that any of our panelists, any of you want to say or close out with that you haven't gotten a chance to touch on yet?
I'm happy to start and just say that what we haven't actually talked about is the cost of criminalization and both the human cost, but also there is a cost of dollars that is related to criminalizing people, whether it's writing tickets, there's a cost to law enforcement. There's a cost to the court systems for having to track all of these tickets that never had any chance of being paid. And I think it's interesting to think about how localities could or should be racking up those costs so that they are providing transparent information to people in their communities about where their resources are going. And if it's going to an ineffective process of moving people around via criminalization rather than solving the problem, maybe I think that a case can be made about using those resources differently. So that's something that we haven't touched on. And I know that there's a few places across the country that have started to do some work in that area. I think San Diego has done a little bit of work in that area and some other places that might be of interest for the audience today.
And I would also say that another part of what we didn't necessarily get to today is who may be our allies in this fight. So I've had a number of conversations with state's attorneys, for instance, who are just diametrically opposed to criminalization. They believe it wastes their time. It prevents them from dealing with more serious issues. And I think have really promoted alternative solutions to addressing the issues of homelessness. And if people are brought into their court, they typically use practices that don't levy these fines that become unimaginable, untenable, whatever you want to use. And I love that the idea of how much it costs, because that was a really important strategy that was used when the idea of permanent supportive housing was in place. And then don't ever let anybody tell you that permanent supportive housing doesn't work. I've run a permanent supportive housing program with 450 people in it. And I know that when research is done, 90% is sometimes the success rate for keeping people in housing in programs. And it is an effective approach. It's not the only approach. And I want to make sure we say that. It's being villainized right now, but it certainly is an effective strategy that we should never take off the table. And hopefully that doesn't happen, although, you know, it's underway. But hopefully we can fight back, and people should let their elected officials know how effective it is. So I'll just add that.
Great. Tristia, final thoughts?
Yeah, just regarding cost, to give an example, I tend to think in examples. So here's how cost has played out in San Jose recently. There are people in functional trailers. They have working bathrooms, working showers, working kitchens, and electricity. Rather than give them a place to park, our city elected to divert the affordable housing dollars and pay a outreach system that reached some, not all of them. And we talked before about the racial implications of that. They hired a tow company to come and tow the vehicle from the individual, leaving, people on the side of the road. We pay the tow company to then tow the vehicle to the dump, pay the dump for, the pleasure of crushing that vehicle. Then, for those who were lucky enough to enter into the system, they went from this whole home into a temporary hotel space, and we pay the hotel for the 2 month to maybe 1 year of hoteling services. Because there's no ability to cook for yourself in the hotel, then we're paying for the food services that they were otherwise meeting for themselves in their trailer. And all of that is case managed and was also managed on site by city workers, by nonprofits, and by the police department, who was ensuring that all of this was moving forward without any sort of security incident. That is a massive amount of money that was spent on a process that at the end will still leave those people without housing, has reduced their ability to actually be self-sufficient, took their most valuable assets, and was far more expensive for San Jose taxpayers. And that's what it can look like in practice.
So I think that's a great note to end on, especially since we're out of time. Karika, did you want to anything? I just wanted to say thank you to our panelists, both for taking your time to be here and speak with our audience today, but also for all the fabulous work that you do. It's much appreciated, and thank you. Karika?
I was just going to say that as well. Thank you all so much for being here. To our panelists, the information that you all shared has been so amazing. The topic is not something that we're excited about, but it's very important for everyone to have the information and to really have a good understanding of what is going on. And you all have been so wonderful with everything you've shared. To everyone that's still on, thank you so much for joining us. I know a lot of people have asking about the recording. We will share this out with everyone. We will also put together a lot of the links that were shared in the chat and send that out along with the recording. Thank you all for being a part of this today, and hope to see you all at our next ICLC community conversation. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Take care.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.